So a tale of two economies. We begin by sort of pitching this in an economic way through globalization and development and sort of a historical approach. A tale of two economies. China, Mongolia, and North Korea relied on central planning by the government. So this is the influence of communism, like we talked about for so many times before when we saw communism mostly throughout Europe and other regions of the world, but mostly our most notable examples were from China and Russia, just because of the nature and the size and the strength of those particular countries. But Mongolia and North Korea followed suit under this communist regime, like the USSR and that of China. However, that tells a different story when we talk about more democratically leaning places that relied on a more balanced economy through supply and demand and market forces, like we see in Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And these are established, they established state-aided economies with the help of the United States and Europe. And so this is coming out at a time post-World War II, when Japan is obviously defeated, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But state-aided economies, again, that are a relatively free market economy that relies on the market, this larger, sort of a more abstract way, but the government strategically intervening when necessary, specifically with finances and things like that. And so it's a tale of two economies in the sense of we see these communist regimes employing their centralized planning and communist systems in China, Mongolia, and North Korea, and then South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan going about it differently. And again, it creates different parallels. These areas, again, remain closer today, and then of course these areas remain closer today and closer with Europe and that of the United States. They are part of the West, even though they're not all, geographically speaking, they're not in the West, but we think of Western countries or Westernized countries, we sometimes would consider these in the same place. So more recently, the differences between the two have diminished because Mongolia has since moved away from central planning as they geared it more localized to their own nation of Mongolia, and especially China, because they've made large gains economically speaking in terms of the adjustments that they've made from the years of Mao Zedong. Now, Mao Zedong was one of their first communist leaders in China. The Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution that takes place, and we're not going to talk too much about the history because that's decades ago, but when the communists took over in China, there was a Great Leap Forward, and there was agricultural adjustments that took place. There were communes, which we'll talk about briefly. When I mean briefly, just like a bullet point, but millions of people died in famines, and it was relatively unsuccessful, and the systems move away from that, and I'm going to let you read about that to your liking in the book. And then we have the Great Leap Forward, and after Mao Zedong comes Deng Xiaoping, and we move forward through the sort of the history of China after Mao, but these Maoist principles come from Mao Zedong when the Communist Party takes over in China decades ago. So we call this the Japanese miracle, and it becomes a model because post-World War II, Japan initiates that state-aided economy, that state-aided market economy. Market economy, again, relying on the market, the ebbs and flows of supply and demand, but then aid from the state. We could break this definition down to be quite simple. When they intervene when necessary, and again, it's quite successful for such a long period of time. From the 1950s, after World War II, into the 1970s, growth of 10% or more taking place in Japan until the last decades in the 1990s when there's stagnation. And what happens is they rely on export-led growth. So of course, when we think about some of our technology and some of our cars and things like that, Japan certainly drives that in these decades and rely on exports to lead their growth. Kaizen is a system of continuous improvement. We think of that as the save time and energy to continually improve the effectiveness of these economic mechanisms that take place and actually lead the way for Japan to be decimated during World War II. I mean, the United States really hands it to them after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Japanese are responsible for that in early December in the 1940s when the United States enters World War II, when the Japanese surprise us and bomb us in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. United States gets involved in World War II, and of course, you may be familiar, but the United States drops incendiary bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and largely decimates these cities, these major cities in Japan. And so after Japan is depleted from that, and for, again, battling throughout the Pacific and claiming land and islands in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, they certainly have a lot of ground to make up, and they do it, and which is why they rise from the ashes. Japan is a phoenix, or a miracle, or what have you. But again, this speaks to where they were and where they've gone. And this miracle, to some extent, I mean, we think of Germany, again, decimated after World War II, broke and confused and angry and frustrated and things, and they've certainly become the leader in the political and economic leader of Europe, and Japan does that to an extent here in East Asia. So the economy of China and reforms. So again, going back, 1949, Communist Party sought improvements to agriculture and industry. And the book does a great job of working us through that historical evolution of the Communist Party and its regimes. Moves forward from communes, those farms of 1,600 some odd people, where they're organized into communes, and they eventually gain more and more freedom through decentralization into the 1980s, where they can make small decisions for themselves through the approval of these small-scale leaders. Again, a very close watch system in terms of the Communist Party and the communist regime. And then we talk about reform. We talk about now, we fast forward, so we're really zooming through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and now present day, when we talk about China and Japan controlling about 20% each of the United States' debt. Everyone wants to talk about the debt. We talked about it in our first chapter, $20+ trillion. China has about 21%, Japan about 19%, so an average about 20% each. And the book states about sometimes folks worry that these countries can destabilize the American economy if they call into question that debt. Right now, it's happening live, literally. Go on Twitter, unfortunately, and it's not really a mechanism for policy change, although it is since 2016. And we can see that there's a trade war going on between the United States and China. Donald Trump promising more and more tariffs between a large partner in terms of China, and this trade war that he's creating. You see the stock market right now, by the day, very volatile because of this, and because of this uncertainty and what that does to the global markets and the markets here in the United States. So again, Communist Party, very influential through China. Even to today, it still has its power. Xi Jinping, current leader of China, and we'll talk about him in just a moment when we talk about power and politics. But again, sought improvements through agriculture and industry in terms of production, and moves from communes to decentralization as the decades pass over the course of 40, 50 years, and into the quasi-state that it is now, because it becomes less and less focused on communism, and it keeps making more and more adjustments to go to a more market economy, although there is a lot of state control yet. So we talk about power and politics now. So political changes toward democracy, and we see this incrementally throughout the region of East Asia. Japan, post-World War II. They don't have a military. The United States and Europe comes to their aid. They move them in a more democratic way after the war. They're allied with Germany and Italy for a time in terms of the Axis powers, that of Japan. They're on the losing side of World War II, and they move in a democratic way after World War II. South Korea moves this way in the 1980s, followed by Taiwan in the 1990s. We say the others. Well, North Korea is certainly not moving in that direction. We could say China moving in that direction, and probably the book sets us up to do that in a small way until most recent events, I don't know how much you watch the news, probably not as much as I'd like you think that you do, but perhaps you've heard Xi Jinping and Chinese leadership has removed term limits for their leadership. So right now Xi Jinping could potentially lead for the amount of time that he sees fit. And so this leader for life idea, like we saw under Mao and previous leaders that have led for decades, could take place again in China. And so it's hard to say what will happen. It might have went one step forward, two steps back in terms of their pursuit toward democracy. And there are just an image, sort of the differences you expect to see between North and South Korea again, based on democracy and their economics and what that does, the differences it leaves for an overall society. Technology and progress is addressed in this chapter when we talk about political freedoms and the use of technology like cell phones and social media. Weibo is a Twitter-like technology, social media, and that's used in China. And the book discusses this idea of the use of cell phones and social media. Again, still restricted, internet use, and some of this stuff is still restricted and censored. They call it the Great Firewall, the Great Firewall, like the Great Wall, but the Great Firewall, and it's censored. So these people are in East Asia, specifically in China, when we use this example, certainly not free to post whatever they'd like on the internet because there are still firewalls. However, this idea has helped link movements more toward democracy and progress. There is still a digital divide that is in the country. Most like all other resources, technology is not any different. 75% of internet users in places like Shanghai, a major trend-setting city that we'll talk about, while there's only 35% of usage in rural areas, probably as we move more and more western direction. And workers' rights and democracy, again, workers' rights, there are more and more demands for higher wages. That will be eventually a strain on the economy as, again, these industries are taking place there because of low wages. We talked about outsourcing. We talked about outsourcing from the United States to India, India to China, China to Bangladesh. We always have to search for a cheaper place to produce our goods and services. And so China's it for now. In some cases, they're already sometimes moving out of that place due to the fight for workers' rights and democracy. We have a university professor and a human rights activist here, Liu Xiaobo, and he is cited in the book as he was imprisoned for the pursuit of decentralization even further and democratic elections. It talks about how he wins a Nobel Prize and how he's imprisoned. He couldn't attend the ceremony and his family couldn't. The book says that he's still in prison. Unfortunately, that is not the case. He has passed away since this book's been published, just since 2017. He passed away within the last year in Chinese custody. And so he's a fighter for progress and for democracy that certainly paid the ultimate price in China. That brings us to urbanization. Tokyo, Japan is the largest urban area in the world. Not so just our region, of course, but the world in general. 38 million inhabitants in that large metro urban area in Tokyo, Japan, seen here. Very densely populated as well. Conurbation is a term from the book. It's a vocabulary term. It's an extended urban area consisting of several nearby cities that have grown together over time. We're certainly seeing this in Asia as we saw those coastal cities growing rapidly in urban sprawl that just start to go into one conglomeration of major urban areas. 2014, all 40 of the world's fastest growing cities in terms of GDP were in China. So it's, again, wages are rising, growth is happening in China. Hong Kong became a special administrative region of China, ASAR, in 1997 after years of British control from a very historical perspective. One of the richest cities in the world with $57,000 US for its gross national income per capita. You see a picture there. It's on the coast in the southeastern portion of East Asia, southeastern portion of China itself. Politically, it has more freedom than that of the rest of China, or much of the rest of China. In 2014, umbrella protests took place where they used umbrellas as shields from gases and the like from the police. And you could read more about that in the book. I encourage you to know about the umbrella protests that took place there in 2014 in Hong Kong. Again, this still talks about the political and economic centers of China and how they drive the Chinese economy and the political structure. And again, this is taking place in coastal areas and largely that of great importance historically for trade, if even European colonization. Shanghai, same sort of story. Paris of the East is a trend-setting city, and that's kind of why it gets that designation. It's a hip, trendy city, beginning with Western trade in the 1800s. It's the largest urban area in China with 23 million people. Famous there is the Nanjing Road, be like our Rodeo Drive in the United States, or our Fifth Avenue or something like that. But again, a trend-setting city, one that attracts financial designation as well as tourism. But again, one of those pillars of China and the region that drives the East Asian economy. Brings us to population and gender, and this term, the graying of Japan. It literally refers to the aging of their people. 93% of the Japanese people live in cities, so this is a great amount, huge amount. The longest life expectancy in the world, with 83 years on average life expectancy. And by 2050, the average age will be 53 years old, and 40% of the population will be retired. This is quite unprecedented for a country. It's starting to take place in parts of Western Europe, Central and Eastern Europe as well, but here in Japan it's quite notable. It has a natural rate of increase of the largest in the world, with the exception of just a few places in Central Eastern Europe. But again, this idea of what will happen when so much of the workforce is retired, what will be the burden on the economy and on the country as a whole when so much of the workforce will be a dependent population, one that will rely on assistance for assisted living, health care, and one that can't support the economy any longer because they'll be outside of the workforce. How will Japan support this population? And again, it's because life expectancy is so high and people do so well in Japan that they live far longer. One-child policy in China, it lasted from 1979 till 2013. There's lingering effects of the one-child policy to this day, largely through gender imbalance and preference. So we see gender imbalance to the tune of there's 50 million more men than women now in this generation that has come up through this time because of the one-child policy and a preference towards males that goes back to Confucian values. 2013 law was to visit the old people. I kind of include that because I think it's kind of interesting that they do put in place. But again, it's because the family is not large anymore, because this idea of aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters is really not a thing to a large extent anymore because of one child per family, that the large families just simply do not exist. In 2013, this is relaxed. In 2015, even further, that it's now like essentially a two-child policy where you can have more children. And there was a learning from Japan to relax this one-child policy from their neighbors. Brings us to socio-cultural issues, ethnic and religious minorities in the region, in East Asia. Largely we're going to talk about China for the most part. When we talk about Western China's Muslims, the Uyghur people and the Kazakhs in Xinjiang. It's a semi-autonomous area out in the far western part of China. This is a Muslim population. They've been tried to be assimilated with the Go West policy of China, where they'd send Han Chinese there to assimilate within the... I have to look away. This is a little bit louder than I thought it was going to be. It's kind of distracting. Viewer discretion advised. I should have put a disclaimer up. So again, the Uyghur people out there are an ethnic Muslim population, as well as the Kazakh people in Xinjiang. Semi-autonomous, that means they have a little bit more control over their own area than does the out of like Beijing, the capital, and out of the the eastern part of China. That this is in the far west. It does sort of assimilate with more of those Central Asian republics, those Central Asian states, like you see there, like Kazakhstan and the Kazakhs and Turkic people. And again, moving the Han Chinese there are to try to assimilate them and remove this center of control, to try to weaken them as a collective and cultural group. There's been some uprisings and protests there since 2009 that kind of go on growing. This attack on Islam that takes place there from a higher level, and there's protests and terrorist activity that take place there. So this is an ongoing iterative process of how they'll be able to cope and control this issue of assimilation and cohabitation, if you will. That leads us to the Tibetans, impoverished Buddhists, and the Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama seen here. He is the 14th Dalai Lama, which is essentially a leader, Buddhist leader, a monk who leads the Buddhist people, the Tibetan people here in that is again a semi-autonomous region of China. At a point, he had to flee to India with some of his followers as he was in exile. But again, a very influential figure in this area. He's the 14th Dalai Lama since 1391. I include that because President John Thrasher of Florida State is the 15th university president since the university was created in 1851. You think about that, and it's quite impressive. These folks lead for quite an awful long time. This Dalai Lama at the moment is 82 years old. They lead for life, like usually from birth to death. And so in this case, Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama since the 1300s, and quite impressive. When you go hundreds of years more for 1851 to present, we've had 15 university presidents going back to only 14 since the 1390s. And so the Tibetan people are of noteworthiness as a religious minority, a religious ethnic minority in China, again, more eastern than the far west. This is an area north of the Himalayas. Indigenous of South China and Taiwan, there's indigenous people there that have a relationship that flow between borders into Southeast Asia, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about Southeast Asia. I think that'd be a good time to talk about that. And the Ainu people of Japan, this is an indigenous population there that have been largely cast out through assimilation, and so they've just over time been assimilated into typical Japanese culture, and they're largely absent now, but their history can be traced to the island of Hokkaido and northern Honshu. And that actually wraps us up, not too fast, that actually wraps us up until the subregion section. So we're done with now part 1 and part 2 of East Asia. It's a whirlwind, a lot of information coming at us in about 23 minutes. We did that section, which is a record time for part 2, when we like to spend more time talking about humans. But going forward, I think we'll finish and wrap it up in a good way when we talk about the subregions of East Asia coming up next.